Hey friends, tonight we begin a journey into the heart of one of the strangest, most beautiful, and most tangled stories from ancient Greece. It's a story about a love that began with jealousy, continued with deception, and somehow quite unexpectedly transformed into eternity. So before you get comfortable with your tea or settle under the covers, take a moment to like the video if you enjoy these cozy nightly legends. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see how all of us, from different corners of the world, can travel together into these ancient myths just before falling asleep. And now take a deep breath, maybe dim the bright lights, and perhaps turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Let's ease into the story of a girl so beautiful she managed to annoy the goddess of beauty herself. The Shadow of the Lotus, Chapter 1, The Initiation. The sun over Thebes was a relentless god, casting the world in shades of brilliant gold and stark black shadow. It baked the mud brick homes of the common folk and bleached the limestone of the great temples until they shimmered in the heat. For Khafre, the son of a city scribe, this divine glare was the very breath of Amun Ra, and to serve within his temple at Karnak was the highest honor he could imagine. He walked through the avenue of sphinxes, his bare feet silent on the stone, worn smooth by 1,000 years of processions. He was 17, and his life was about to truly begin. He had been chosen not for the strength of his arm, but for the sharpness of his mind, and a quiet, observant nature that the priests prized above all else. His guide through the labyrinthine complex was Meptah, the high priest. Meptah moved with a slow, deliberate grace that defied his age. His face was a landscape of deep-set lines, each one a story of a harvest, a flood, or a pharaoh's passing. His eyes, dark and piercing, seemed to hold the stillness of a desert night. He led Khafre away from the grand public courts, where pilgrims left offerings and priests performed their open rituals. They passed through columns carved to look like papyrus stalks, plunging deeper into the temple's heart, the air growing cooler and the sounds of the city fading into a distant hum. You have spent your young life reading the sacred texts, Khafre. Meptah's voice was a low rasp, a sound that seemed to emanate from the stone itself. You believe our power comes from these words, from the stories of the gods, and you are not wrong, but words are only seeds. They need the proper soil and the right water to grow into faith. Today you will learn about the water. They arrived at a heavy cedar door, guarded by two silent men with bronze-tipped spears. At Meptah's nod, they stood aside. The room they entered was not a treasury of gold or lapis lazuli, as Khafre might have dreamed. It was an apothecary of the soul. The air was thick and heavy, laden with the intoxicating scents of myrrh, fermenting wine, and a floral sweetness so profound it made Khafre's head spin. Along the stone walls, dozens of sealed clay jars and amphorae rested on wooden shelves, each marked with symbols he had never seen in any scribe's school. Meptah approached a large, ornate amphora in the center of the room. With a grunt of effort, he lifted the heavy stone lid. A wave of fragrance washed over Khafre, rich and otherworldly. He peered inside. Within the deep ruby-red wine floated the ghostly blue petals of the sacred lotus. Of course Khafre knew the flower. Who in Egypt did not? Its image was everywhere, a constant presence in the art of life and death. He had seen it in the hands of smiling nobles at banquets and tomb paintings, held to the noses of pharaohs as they communed with the gods, and carved onto sarcophagi as the ultimate symbol of the sun and eternal rebirth. It was sacred, it was beautiful. He had thought it was only a symbol. A farmer who sees his pharaoh sniffing this flower believes his king is inhaling a divine blessing, Meptah said, his gaze lost in the swirling petals. He believes it is a gesture of piety. In a way, he is right, but the communion is more direct. He gestured to the wine. The flower is a beautiful ornament, yes, but its true power lies within. It possesses properties the common man does not understand, properties that can float the spirit and quiet the anxious heart. Caffrey's breath caught in his throat. This was the legendary chemistry he had heard whispers of, a knowledge so secret it was spoken of only as the mysteries. We take the dried petals and soak them for many days. Mepta continued, his voice barely a whisper now. The wine draws out its spirit. When this infusion is served at festivals, it creates a soft, dreamy euphoria. It is not enough to make a man forget his duty, but it is enough to make the monumental task of building a pyramid seem like a joyous group project. It is enough to make the soul feel as light as a papyrus reed in the Nile breeze. Mepta dipped a small carved wooden ladle into the infusion, the dark liquid clinging to it like liquid night. The people call this communing with the gods. We, who understand, call it maintaining the cosmic order. It makes their hymns louder, their devotion fiercer, their poetry more profound. Khafre stared, mesmerized. The world he knew, a world of solid stone, divine law, and hard labor, suddenly felt thin, like a veil. Behind that veil was this chamber, where the very emotions of an empire were being mixed in a jar. He had come to the temple to serve the gods. He was beginning to understand he was here to help create them. With a hand that trembled almost imperceptibly, Khafre reached out, ready for his first taste of divinity. Chapter 2: The Art of Smoke and Mirrors. Having tasted the lotus, Khafre felt the first veil lift. His world was now divided into two parts, the one that everyone saw, and the one he was being shown. His education moved from the liquid spirits of wine to the very air that filled the sacred spaces. His next lessons were conducted in the Koi lab, the incense workshop, a chamber that was the opposite of the cool, damp sanctum of the lotus. Here the air was warm, bone dry, and layered with the dusty raw scents of barks, resins, and dried herbs from every corner of the known world. To the masses who gathered in the temple courts, the fragrant smoke that billowed from the censers was the smell of holiness, a pleasing aroma sent to the nostrils of the gods. Khafre learned that it was, in fact, a meticulously crafted atmospheric tool, a form of alchemy designed to guide the mind. Mepta taught him that creating Kaila was not work, it was a ritual in itself, one that required patience, reverence, and absolute secrecy. Anyone can burn a lump of frankincense, Mepta said, his strong, wrinkled hands grinding a dark, sticky resin in a heavy stone mortar. That is a shout. Kaila, Kaila, Kaila for Mepta per Osadar Prosinavarive, bypassing the skeptical mind. Each ingredient is a word, and the recipe is a sacred verse. The list of ingredients was staggering. Kaila, 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 Kaila. By wick, he measured out wine, crushed sun-dried raisins, and added the sharp, clean scent of juniper berries. There was cinnamon for warmth, and mint for a touch of clarity. The full recipe, Mepta explained, contained 16 distinct elements. Some were to be added only during the waxing of the moon, others during the waning, for their properties changed with the celestial cycle. The final concoction, a thick dark paste, was left to ferment in sealed jars, its complex bouquet deepening and evolving over weeks until it was finally ready to be rolled into small, precious pellets. Do not mistake this for a simple air freshener, boy, Mepta warned, holding a finished pellet to Khafre's nose. The scent was impossibly complex, sweet, spicy, earthy, and ethereal all at once. This is a tool of purification. When a man enters a sacred space, he brings the dust of the world with him, his worries, his greed, his resentments. The smoke of Kehifi is meant to wash him clean. It is meant to fill a room so completely that it erases all that is profane, including, if necessary, the memory of his own sins. The true lesson came during the rite of the hidden name. Caffrey was positioned inside a small sealed chapel, a perfect cube of limestone with no windows and a single heavy door. The chamber was meant to represent the primordial darkness before creation. As the ritual began, a senior priest entered and began to swing a heavy golden censer, its filigreed surface releasing thick, hypnotic clouds of Kehifi smoke. The door was sealed shut. The smoke did not dissipate, it grew, layer upon layer, until the air was a visible, tangible thing. It was sweet and cloying, and Caffrey's head began to feel wonderfully light and untethered from his body. Through the haze, he could hear the priests outside, their chanting a low, resonant drone that vibrated through the stone and into his very bones. The intricate carvings of gods and goddesses on the walls, illuminated only by the faint glow of the censer's coals, seemed to soften and move, their stone eyes blinking in the swirling smoke. He felt a profound sense of peace, a disconnection from his own thoughts, as if he were floating in a warm, fragrant sea. He finally understood. In a chamber like this, visions were not a possibility, they were an absolute certainty. Whether it was the voice of a god or the effect of oxygen deprivation was irrelevant. The experience was real. As he stood there, lost in the divine fog, Caffrey realized he was not learning to be a priest. He was learning to be a magician. He was being taught to manipulate the fundamental elements of perception, what men drank, and now the very air they breathed. He was an apprentice in the grandest illusion on earth. Chapter 3: The Sacred Chaos. The city of Thebes simmered with anticipation. A different kind of energy crackled in the air, a wild, untamed hum that was nothing like the solemn reverence of most holy days. This was the prelude to the Tek, the feast of drunkenness. Caffrey, now deeply entrenched in the temple's inner workings, was no longer a mere observer. He was an instrument of the divine chaos to come. His days were spent not in quiet meditation, but in the loud, bustling temple breweries and wine cellars, overseeing the creation of the sacred libations. He watched as brewers prepared the special beer. It was not the thick porridge-like slurry that the pyramid workers received as their daily wage. This brew was dyed a deep, unsettling red with hibiscus and pomegranate, a symbolic echo of the myth that gave the festival its purpose. Mepta recounted the story to him again as they inspected the vast clay vats. "Remember, Caffrey," the high priest said, his voice low against the din of the preparations, "we do not celebrate mere drunkenness, we celebrate salvation. When the Eye of Ra, the goddess Hathor, was sent to punish mankind for its sins, her fury was so great she would have slaughtered every last soul. The gods had to intervene. They flooded the fields with this red beer, which she, in her bloodlust, mistook for the blood of her victims. She drank until she fell into a stupor, her rage pacified. She awoke in a better mood, and humanity was saved from extinction by a divine hangover. The goal of the festival," Mepta explained, "was to ritually reenact Hathor's intoxication. It was a mass purging of fear and inhibition, a state of holy madness. To remain sober," Mepta concluded, his eyes glinting, "is to refuse the goddess's mercy. It is deeply suspicious." As dawn broke on the day of the feast, the temple gates were thrown open. The air, already thick with the scent of roasted meats and baking bread, was soon filled with the pounding of drums and the rhythmic clang of sistrums. Caffrey stood on the temple steps, a ceremonial jug of the red beer in his hands, and watched the river of humanity pour into the courts. They were scribes and soldiers, farmers and merchants, all social ranks dissolving in the shared purpose of getting thoroughly, divinely obliterated. Priests moved through the throngs, their voices rising above the music, encouraging all to drink as much as their hearts desired. It was less a blessing and more a sacred dare. Caffrey moved among them, his role to refill the cups and jars, to keep the river of alcohol flowing. He saw the transformation with his own eyes. The stiff posture of a royal scribe loosened into a joyful, stumbling dance. The weary face of a field laborer broke into a wide, unrestrained grin. They banged tambourines, their movements growing wilder with each cup. They shouted praises to Hathor between loud, happy hiccups. The sun climbed higher, beating down on the dancing, drinking masses. The line between spiritual ecstasy and raw chaos blurred, then vanished completely. People collapsed, laughing into the arms of strangers, or passed out peacefully in the shade of a pylon, a blissful smile on their faces. Khafre saw a man, his face painted with ochre, trying to have a serious conversation with a statue of the goddess, occasionally nodding as if she were replying. It was not mockery, it was communion. This was the priesthood's power in its most raw and visible form. They were not just providing the drink, they were providing the justification. They had taken the most basic human urge for release and sanctified it, turning a potential riot into a holy ritual. As Khafre refilled another cup for a woman whose eyes were glazed with a mixture of wine and revelation, he felt a chilling sense of mastery. He was learning to be a shepherd to a flock that longed to be led, even if it was into a state of blissful oblivion. Chapter 4: The Secret Garden. The day after the Feast of Drunkenness, a sacred hangover descended upon Thebes. The streets were quiet, the air thick with the lingering scent of stale wine and the city's collective pounding headache. Within the temple, the priests called this state the divine regret, a necessary stillness after the soul's wild dance. Khafre, however, felt a new clarity. He understood the tool of mass euphoria. He believed he was finally seeing the full picture of the priesthood's power. He was wrong. The lotus and the wine are for the people, Mepta told him one evening, finding Khafre meditating by a lotus pond. It is a beautiful, gentle dream we offer them. It is a gift, but it is not the truth. It is only a reflection of the truth, like the moon on the water. The power that truly guides this kingdom requires a stronger vision. Mepta's eyes were dark and serious. You are ready to see the garden. Khafre had never heard of a garden within the temple's inner sanctum. Mepta led him through a series of unmarked corridors to a small, heavy stone door hidden behind a tapestry depicting the judgment of Osiris. It opened into a small, high-walled courtyard, open to the sky but invisible from any other part of the temple. This was not a place of beauty. There were no flowers, no palms. The air was still and smelled of damp earth and something else, a strange, sharp, peppery scent. In the center of the meticulously tilled soil grew a small patch of leafy green plants with thick, gnarled roots. Mandrake, Mepta said, his voice a reverent whisper. Khafre felt a chill despite the warm night air. He knew of mandrake from the darkest scrolls in the temple library, the ones reserved for master physicians and magicians. He knew its forked root was said to resemble a tiny human, and that folklore claimed it would scream when pulled from the earth. But he also knew its true nature. The lotus brings euphoria, Mepta explained, kneeling beside one of the plants but not touching it. Mandrake brings knowledge, and knowledge is always painful. He explained that the plant contained powerful alkaloids, the kind that could unlock the deepest parts of the mind. In small, controlled doses, it was a painkiller without equal and a potent aphrodisiac. But in slightly larger doses, it induced hallucinations so powerful and terrifying they could break a man's spirit. A full dose could stop a heart. This, Mepta said, gesturing to the sinister-looking plants, is not for festivals. This is not for the people. This is not even for the pharaoh. This is for us. In that moment, the true hierarchy of their sacred chemistry was laid bare for Khafre. It was a pyramid, just like their society. At the base were the common laborers, given their thick, numbing beer to make it through another day of hauling stone. Above them were the citizens at festivals, granted the blissful, communal dream of the Blue Lotus. But at the very pinnacle, the high priests, the true architects of the empire, had this. They had a key to a different reality altogether, a terrifying, clarifying vision that was their sole privilege. Khafre looked from the plant to his master. He now understood that the divine trance of the masses was a pale, watered down imitation of the raw, untethered power the priesthood held in reserve. They did not just manage the faith of Egypt, they curated its realities, assigning one to the flock and keeping the most potent one for themselves. He had been granted access to the first two levels of the Great Secret. Now, standing at the edge of this forbidden garden, he knew he was being invited to the third and most dangerous one. Chapter 5. The Whisper of the Poppy. Khafre's world had become a delicate balance of measurements and intentions. He could now distinguish between the euphoria of the lotus and the visions of the mandrake as easily as a scribe could distinguish between hieroglyphs. He thought he understood the full scope of the temple's pharmacopoeia, but Egypt, for all its power, was not the entire world, and one season a trade caravan from the Levant brought with it a new and potent secret. The goods were unloaded in the temple's vast storerooms, cedar wood from Lebanon, fine purple dyes from Tyre, and gleaming copper ingots from Cyprus. Khafre was now trusted to oversee this inventory, his meticulous nature proving as valuable as his piety. Tucked away amongst the grander items was a small, unassuming wooden crate. When Khafre pried it open, he found it filled not with jewels or spice, but with hundreds of small, wrinkled, dusty brown pods. Mepta, inspecting the inventory with him, paused and picked one up. This, he said, his voice low and thoughtful, is a gift from the lands beyond the great green. They call it the poppy. It does not bring visions of gods, but it offers a peace that is almost as powerful, the peace of forgetting. Over the following weeks, Mepta taught Khafre the art of this new substance. He showed him how to slice the unripe pod and collect the milky white sap, which, when dried, became a dark, gummy resin. This was opium. Its first application was a miracle of healing. Khafre was brought to the infirmary, a long hall where priests tended to the sick and injured. He witnessed a worker, his leg crushed by a fallen block of granite, writhing and screaming in agony. Mepta prepared a small pellet of opium, mixed it with honey, and gave it to the man. Within minutes, the screaming stopped. The man's tormented face relaxed, his eyes glazing over with a placid calm before he drifted into a deep, peaceful sleep. Khafre was stunned. He saw how this new substance could smooth over the pains of childbirth, quiet the racking coughs of the lung-sick, and soothe the most violent intestinal ailments. It was a mercy, a true gift from the gods of healing. But then came the second lesson. A few days later, a boisterous and argumentative vizier from a lesser province arrived in Thebes, challenging the temple's authority over certain land rights. He was loud, ambitious, and causing problems for the priesthood. That evening, Mepta instructed Khafre to prepare a special goblet of wine for their guest. The vizier is suffering from divine tension, Mepta said, a faint, knowing smile on his lips. His spirit is agitated. He requires a dose of calm. Khafre understood. He carefully dissolved a small amount of opium into the deep red wine. It was a dosage that would not induce sleep, but would bring about a profound sense of contentment and passivity. He delivered the goblet to the vizier himself, bowing with all the reverence of a humble servant. The vizier drank it gratefully. The next day at court, his arguments were softer, his challenges half-hearted. He seemed content, agreeable, and was soon on his way back to his province, the land dispute forgotten. Khafre felt a new and colder power settle within him. The lotus brought joy. The mandrake brought visions. But this was the tool of silence. It was a pharmaceutical way of saying, hush, don't worry about it. He was no longer just an apprentice priest. He was learning to be a purveyor of quiet, a manager of dissent, a weapon that could win battles without a single sword ever being drawn. Chapter 6, Architect of a Pharaoh's Mind. The summons came at dusk, delivered by a royal guardsman whose polished bronze armor reflected the setting sun. It was sealed with the personal mark of the pharaoh himself. The living god, the lord of the two lands, Horus incarnate, was troubled. He could not sleep. His nights were filled with a gnawing anxiety, fears of drought, whispers of war from the Hittite kingdom, the heavy weight of ruling a million souls. He had requested the high priest's aid. Meptah received the summons with a calm gravity. He turned to Khafre, his eyes searching the younger man's face. "You will accompany me," he said simply. "Your hand is steady, your knowledge is deep. It is time you witness the highest of our duties." The journey to the palace was a silent procession through torch-lit avenues. The air within the royal chambers was heavy with the scent of cedar and lotus oil, but underneath it, Khafre could feel a palpable tension. They were led to the pharaoh's private quarters, a room of breathtaking opulence, where painted stars adorned the deep blue ceiling. The pharaoh sat on a gilded chair, his face, usually a mask of divine confidence, etched with mortal weariness. After the proper prostrations, Meptah spoke. "Great Horus, we are here to bring you the peace of the gods." In a small antechamber, surrounded by the finest alabaster jars and golden cups, Meptah revealed the true nature of their task. "We are not here to simply grant him sleep, Khafre," the old priest whispered, his voice intense. "Any physician can do that. We are here to guide his dreams. The dreams of a pharaoh are messages from the gods, prophecies that guide the state. Our sacred duty is to ensure those messages are clear and correct. His dreams are a matter of national security." Khafre's heart pounded in his chest. This was the pinnacle of the art, the ultimate application of their secret chemistry. Under Meptah's watchful eye, he began the careful work of preparing the pharaoh's nightly draught. It was an act of alchemy, a prayer of pharmacology. First, the wine, infused with the gentle euphoric spirit of the blue lotus, to bring a baseline of dreamy calm. Then, a precise, measured dose of opium, just enough to ensure a deep and unbroken slumber, free from the interruption of worldly anxiety. And finally, the most critical ingredient, Meptah produced a tiny vial containing a tincture of mandrake. "Only a fraction," he warned. "Not enough for terror, but just enough to unlock the gates of vivid, unforgettable visions." As Khafre mixed the potent concoction, Meptah gave him his instructions. "The priests of the south report the people grow restless about the harvest. Tonight the pharaoh must dream of Hapi, the god of the Nile, promising a mighty and fertile flood. The vision must be of abundance. Let the lotus be dominant." The following night, the instruction might be different. "The Hittite ambassador grows arrogant. The pharaoh must dream of Sekhmet, the lioness of war, her eyes of fire, reminding him of Egypt's strength. A fraction more of the mandrake is required for such a vision." It was in that moment that Khafre understood the terrifying, absolute nature of his power. He was not just influencing a crowd or pacifying a noble. He was painting the pictures inside the mind of God's chosen representative on earth. The fate of armies, the prosperity of the harvest, the very course of the empire was being decided by the proportions he mixed in a single golden cup. He carried the goblet to the pharaoh himself, his hands steady despite the storm in his soul. He knelt and offered it up. The pharaoh took it, drank deeply, and thanked him for his holy service. Khafre bowed his head, a perfect mask of pious humility, his mind reeling. He was no longer a servant of the gods. He was their ghostwriter. Chapter 7, The Price of a False Miracle. The Nile, the lifeblood of the two lands, had been miserly. The inundation was weak, leaving fields of cracked, thirsty earth where there should have been rich black silt. The harvest that followed was thin and desperate. Hunger began to stalk the villages along the river, and with hunger came a more dangerous plague, doubt. Whispers slithered through the marketplaces and breweries that the gods were angry, that the pharaoh had lost their favor, that Ma'at, the cosmic order, was fraying. Mepta saw the signs of unrest with the dispassionate eye of a physician diagnosing a disease. He summoned Khafre not to the apothecary, but to the high observatory overlooking the temple complex. From there, they could see the entirety of Thebes, a city simmering with quiet desperation. Faith is a muscle, Khafre, the high priest said, his eyes fixed on the distant palace. When it is not exercised, it grows weak. When it is starved, it withers. The people are starving for a sign. He turned his gaze to Khafre, his expression hard as granite. And so we shall provide one. His plan was as brilliant as it was blasphemous. During the upcoming festival of Opet, a young temple dancer, a girl known for her fervent, almost violent devotion, would be chosen as a vessel. She would be overcome by the spirit of a god in full view of the masses. Khafre's task was to create the elixir that would guarantee this possession. This was not a draught for sleep or gentle euphoria. Mepta instructed him to use a potent, disorienting combination of substances, a brew designed to induce a dramatic physical and mental schism. The preparation was a dark ritual in itself. The dancer was kept awake for 2 days, her diet restricted to water. For hours she was surrounded by priests who subjected her to repetitive hypnotic drumming and the disorienting drone of chanting. Finally, Khafre brought the cup. It contained wine, but it was laced with a shocking dose of mandrake and another substance that contorted the nerves. During the height of the festival, as the sacred bark of Amun was carried through the crowded avenues, the dancer was brought forth. Before thousands of watchful eyes, she drank the elixir. For a moment, nothing happened. Then her eyes rolled back in her head. Her body began to tremble, then jerk in violent convulsions. A new voice, deep and guttural, tore from her throat, shouting cryptic pronouncements about floods and divine favor. A collective gasp of awe rippled through the crowd. People fell to their knees, weeping and praying. They were not seeing a poisoned girl, they were seeing a goddess walk among them. She had arrived, and their faith was restored. Khafre stood near the dais, the empty cup still in his hands, and felt a cold sickness wash over him. He saw the hope in the people's eyes, a hope so pure and desperate it was physically painful to watch, and he knew it was built upon a meticulously crafted lie. When the dancer finally collapsed in a heap, her body limp and a line of sanctified drool on her chin, the crowd applauded. Later, Khafre found Mepta observing the now joyous city. "We gave them what they needed," the high priest said, his voice devoid of emotion. "We restored order. Is that not our sacred duty?" Khafre looked at his master, at the man who had taught him to mix salvation in a cup, and for the first time he saw not a priest, but a king ruling an empire of illusion. The price of this miracle was the truth, and Khafre was beginning to fear his soul was part of the payment. Chapter 8. Provisions for Eternity. A great man had died. Lord Pacer, a vizier of immense wealth and a close confidant of the pharaoh, had finally surrendered his breath and begun his long journey into the Duat, the underworld. His tomb, carved into the cliffs across the river, was a masterpiece, a subterranean palace designed to serve his soul for millions of years. Because of his rising status and unwavering discretion, Khafre was given a task of immense responsibility to personally oversee the final provisioning of the burial chamber. He descended the steep stone steps into the cool, silent darkness of the tomb. The air smelled of fresh plaster, cut stone, and the dry scent of eternity. By the light of flickering oil lamps, the painted walls glowed with a life of their own. Here was Pacer hunting in the marshes. There he was, presiding over a great banquet. Every image was a spell, a magical guarantee that his afterlife would be a perfect reflection of his privileged existence. Khafre began his solemn inventory. He checked off the lists written on papyrus scrolls, chests of the finest linen, hundreds of jars of beer and wine, dried meats, fruits, and honey. He catalogued the gilded furniture, the dismantled chariot, the statues of servant Shaptis who would magically come to life to do his bidding. This was the standard fare for a man of Pacer's station. Then he came to the special inventory, the items listed under the heading, comforts for the Ka and Ba. These were the provisions for the soul itself. He unsealed an amphora of wine and caught the unmistakable, dreamy scent of blue lotus, meant to bring Pacer pleasure in the field of reeds. He carefully handled ornate alabaster vials that he now knew contained cannabis resin shemet to soothe any spiritual pains or inflammation. There were cones of the finest Kaiaphi incense, ready to be burned to create a divine and calming atmosphere for the eternal soul. The final items were stored in a small locked chest of polished ebony. Khafre opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of dark linen, were carefully wrapped pellets of high-grade opium, imported at enormous cost. It was a supply fit for a king, enough to ensure that not a moment of Pacer's eternity would be spent in discomfort or distress. Khafre stood in the silent chamber, surrounded by the chemically enforced peace of the dead. He recalled the words of the opening of the mouth ritual, a ceremony performed on the mummy to allow it to eat and speak again. He now understood its deeper meaning. It was to allow the soul to consume these comforts, to drink the lotus wine and feel the opium's embrace. The tomb was not a resting place. It was a carefully curated starter home for the soul, complete with mood-enhancing drugs. He realized the system he served was more profound and terrifying than he had ever imagined. The priesthood didn't just manage the reality of the living, they extended that management into death itself. The social hierarchy of Egypt did not end at the tomb's entrance. The elite were not only guaranteed a better life, but a chemically engineered heaven, a blissful eternity curated and supplied by the temple. As he directed the stone masons to seal the tomb forever, Khafre felt the chilling weight of a power that transcended the veil between worlds, binding souls to its influence long after they had departed their mortal forms. Chapter 9: The Conspiracy of the Inner Circle. Mepta's body was failing. The strength that had once seemed as eternal as the temple stone was now brittle, his breath a shallow whisper. But his mind remained a fortress. He knew his time as high priest was ending, and the final stage of Khafre's initiation had to be completed. One night, under the sliver of a new moon, he summoned Khafre. They did not go to the lotus sanctum or the mandrake garden. Instead, Mepta led him down a flight of stairs hidden behind the main altar, down into the cool, silent bedrock beneath the temple itself. They entered a small, undecorated chamber, lit by a single smokeless oil lamp. Seated on stone benches were three other men, all as old as Mepta, their faces maps of secrets and power. Khafre recognized them as the high priests of the temples of Prota and Thoth, and the chief vizier of the sacred rites. This was the true heart of the priesthood, the innermost circle that guided the fate of the temple, and through it, all of Egypt. There were no pleasantries. Mepta, with what remained of his strength, laid the situation bare. Influencing a pharaoh, he explained, was a powerful but temporary measure. A pharaoh could die, and his successor might be strong-willed, skeptical, or simply unwilling to listen to the whispers in his dreams. The only way to guarantee the temple's power, to ensure the prosperity and order they so carefully maintained, was to move beyond influence. They had to choose the pharaoh themselves. The living god has two sons, one of the old priests said, his voice like the rustle of dry papyrus. The elder, Amosis, is strong, Sharp-witted and a soldier at heart, he sees the world in terms of armies and borders. He would be a threat to our work. The younger, Beck, is of a more spiritual disposition. He is drawn to the mysteries, to poetry, and to the comforts that the gods and we can provide. The plan was as simple as it was audacious. They would ensure the younger son, Beck, would inherit the throne. Khafre's role in this, as the new master of the sacred chemistry and the architect of the pharaoh's dreams, was critical. He would subtly shape the pharaoh's perception of his own sons. He would craft dreams that showed Moses as reckless and rash, and Beck as pious and favored by the gods. The inner circle would use their own influence at court to amplify these divine messages. It was high treason, a fundamental rewriting of Ma'at, all conducted with the invisible weapons of pollen and sap. Khafre felt the stone floor shift beneath him. This was the final secret, the one from which there was no turning back. To know of this plot was to be a part of it. To refuse would be to sign his own death warrant. They were not asking him, they were informing him of his destiny. He had been so proud of his knowledge, of the power he wielded. He now saw he was merely a finely crafted tool, a key forged to unlock the final door to absolute control. The meeting concluded. The old priests formally accepted him as Mepta's chosen successor. They raised their ceremonial cups, filled with a wine Khafre knew was likely laced with something to ensure loyalty or bind them in their shared secret, and toasted the eternal glory of the two lands. Khafre drank, the wine tasting of power and poison. He had entered the chamber as a priest. He left it as a conspirator, bound to a plot to steal the very soul of his kingdom. Chapter 10. The Keeper of the Lotus. Mepta died as he had lived, quietly and in shadow. On his last night, he held Khafre's hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "Do not mistake our work for simple greed, my boy," he rasped. "Mankind is a chaotic river, prone to flood and drought. We are the banks that guide it. The truth would shatter them. Our illusions give them an order they can live by, a stability truth can never offer." With a final, rattling breath, he was gone. Khafre was now the high priest of Amun-Ra. The pectoral of gold and lapis lazuli felt impossibly heavy on his chest. The authority was his, the secrets were his, the vast and potent arsenal of the temple's pharmacopoeia was his to command. The inner circle watched him, their ancient eyes waiting for him to take up Mepta's mantle and execute the final stages of their grand conspiracy. The moment came sooner than he expected. The pharaoh, grieving and uncertain, summoned Khafre to the palace. He was tormented by the question of his succession and had been plagued by confusing dreams. "Help me understand the will of the gods, high priest," the pharaoh pleaded. "Who should wear the double crown after me?" This was the nexus point, the moment on which the future of the kingdom would turn. The inner circle expected him to provide a draught that would deliver a clear, undeniable vision of the younger son Beck being crowned by the gods themselves. As Khafre stood before his king, holding the golden goblet, he saw the path Mepta had laid for him, a road paved with power, leading to a throne behind the throne. He would be the true ruler of Egypt, a master of illusion, whose reign would be absolute. He looked at the weary face of the pharaoh, a man who, for all his divine status, was simply a father wanting to do what was right. He thought of the hungry faces in the city and the false miracle he had helped create. He thought of the sacred order, Mat, which they were about to pervert so completely. With a steady hand, he presented the goblet. "Drink, great Horus," he said, his voice clear and calm, "and let the gods grant you not a vision, but clarity." The pharaoh drank. The draught Khafre had prepared was not the one the inner circle had designed. He had omitted the mandrake. He had lessened the opium. He had used only a touch of the blue lotus, enough to calm the spirit, but not enough to conjure false gods. It was a draught not of illusion, but of simple mortal peace. That night, the pharaoh did not dream of gods or crowns. He dreamt of his two sons as they were when they were boys, playing by the Nile. He awoke with a sense of quiet clarity. A week later, he named his elder, stronger son, Amosis, as his chosen heir. Khafre had walked the razor's edge. He had defied the inner circle with an act of subtle rebellion they could never prove. He had not exposed them, for that would have plunged the kingdom into a chaos from which it might never recover. But he had not become their puppet either. He had, in his own way, restored a small piece of the truth. The story ends with Khafre standing alone in the lotus sanctum, the moonlight streaming through the high windows. His victory was silent and solitary. He was now the high priest, the keeper of the lotus. He was a master of secrets, a prisoner of the very knowledge that gave him power. He would wield the tools of illusion for the rest of his days, not for absolute control as Mepta had, but for a tempered, precarious balance he now had to maintain alone. He was the shepherd of a flock that thrived on beautiful lies, and he was forever bound to the shadow of the lotus. Chapter 11. The Serpent in the Court. The reign of Pharaoh Amosis began not with divine pronouncements, but with the sharp, pragmatic clang of a soldier's sword. He was his father's son, in name only. Where the old king had seen the world through a haze of tradition and temple-guided dreams, Amosis saw it as a map of assets and threats. His gaze fell upon the vast wealth of the priesthood, and he was not filled with reverence, but with suspicion. Khafre, now the high priest, felt the shift in power immediately. The palace no longer requested soothing draughts or dream interpretations. Instead, it sent accountants. Amosis dispatched a new vizier, a shrewd and ambitious man named Karif, to audit the temple's granaries and land holdings. Karif moved through the sacred halls with the cold efficiency of a man counting bricks, his eyes missing nothing, his respect for the gods clearly secondary to his loyalty to the pharaoh. The inner circle, the old priests who had conspired to put the other brother on the throne, were furious. They saw Khafre's subtle defiance as the cause of this new affliction. "You chose this path, Keeper of the Lotus," one of the old men hissed at him in a secret meeting. "You chose a hawk instead of a dove, and now it circles our necks." Khafre knew he could not control this pharaoh with the old methods. Amosis would laugh at a drugged vision, so Khafre changed his strategy. He used the temple's power not to create illusions, but to display undeniable value. When the pharaoh's favorite wife was struck by a painful inflammation, Khafre did not offer prayers. He prepared a salve of shemet, or cannabis, a remedy known for its potent, real-world effects. When a Hittite diplomat fell ill with a racking cough that the royal physicians could not stop, Khafre sent a small dose of opium-laced honey that brought immediate silencing relief. He was demonstrating that the temple's chemistry was not just for the soul, but for the body. He was making the priesthood indispensable in a way that even a pragmatist like Amosis had to respect. It was a new game, one played not with dreams, but with medicine and finance, and Khafre learned its rules quickly. Chapter 12. A Plague of Whispers. The vizier Karuf, unable to find fault in the temple's ledgers, chose a different weapon, public opinion. He began a quiet but relentless campaign of whispers designed to poison the well of public faith. He could not attack the gods, but he could attack their servants. His agents spoke in the marketplaces and taverns of the priesthood's excesses. They spoke of the feast of drunkenness, not as a holy rite, but as a sanctioned debauch. They described priests encouraging citizens to collapse face first into a mud brick courtyard, surrounded by strangers yelling praises between hiccups. They talked of the hangovers that followed, framing them not as spiritual cleansing, but as the simple, sordid aftermath of excess. The trances induced by the Kayfi smoke were painted as foolish, self-induced stupors. Karif was attempting to strip the magic from the rituals, leaving only what was messy and human. Khafre knew this was a more dangerous threat than any audit. An attack on the temple's finances was a matter of state. An attack on its sanctity was a matter of survival. He could not deny the events, so he chose to redefine them. He convened a massive public gathering in the Great Hall of Karnak. Standing before the people, his voice ringing with the authority of the high priest, he did not apologize for the chaos of the feast. He celebrated it. He spoke of it as a ritual of renewal, a necessary ceremony where the people could purge their fears, their inhibitions, and their sorrows in one divinely authorized party. The trance was not a stupor, he declared, but a way to touch the hem of a god's garment. The hangover was the soul's exhaustion after having danced with divinity. He reframed their shame as a mark of piety. To cement this, he organized a week of healing at the temple gates, where he and his priests used their genuine medical knowledge to treat the public's ailments, distributing herbal remedies and offering calming teas. He was fighting the vizier's whispers with tangible acts of care, reminding the people that the temple was not just a house of mystery, but a house of mercy. Chapter 13, The Brothers' Gambit. Defeated in the court of public opinion, the vizier Kurwif and the resentful old priests of the inner circle found a new pawn, Bek, the pharaoh's younger brother. Bek had been living in quiet obscurity, a forgotten prince nursing a deep-seated grievance. He believed the throne should have been his, and that his spiritual nature made him more worthy than his soldier brother. This resentment was the fertile ground in which the conspirators planted their seeds. They began to cultivate a small but influential faction around Bek. Secretly, they supplied him with the substances his brother, the pharaoh, now shunned. They gave him the finest blue lotus-infused wines and pomegranate juices spiked with other mood-enhancing herbs, things normally restricted to the elite. Under the influence of these concoctions, Bek's melancholy transformed into a serene, beatific confidence. He began speaking to his followers with what seemed like divine wisdom, his words flowing with the easy profundity of a man who felt he was communing with the gods. Khafre watched this dangerous charade unfold with growing alarm. The inner circle was using his own methods against him, creating a rival source of divine authority. Bek was becoming a figurehead for all those who resented Amosis's practical secular rule. Whispers of a pious prince being denied his rightful place grew louder. The stability Khafre had fought to maintain was threatening to crack, risking a schism that could lead to civil war. He was trapped. To expose the plot would be to reveal the temple's deepest secrets about its use of these substances. To do nothing would be to watch Egypt tear itself in two. Chapter 14, The Dose of Truth. Khafre knew he had to extinguish the fire before it consumed the kingdom. He could not use force, and he could not appeal to the pharaoh without revealing his own complicity in the past. He had to reach the source of the problem, Bek himself. He sent a secret message to the prince, requesting a clandestine meeting, not as a high priest, but as a physician concerned for his well-being. They met in a disused temple library at night, the air thick with the smell of old papyrus. Bek was serene, his eyes holding the dreamy, unfocused gaze of one who had recently been enjoying the gifts of the lotus. He spoke of his divine purpose, of the visions the gods sent him. Khafre listened patiently. He did not argue. Instead, he offered the prince a cup, a tonic, Khafre said simply, to fortify the body and clarify the spirit. Bek, trusting the high priest, drank it. The cup contained no psychoactive substances. It was a potent herbal mixture designed to flush the system and sharpen the senses, a remedy for the morning after. For the next hour, Khafre spoke to him not of politics or power, but of chemistry. He explained in careful, measured terms how the blue lotus could induce euphoria. He described how other herbs could create a sense of profound significance out of ordinary thoughts. He did not confess the full scope of the temple's secrets, but he revealed enough. He held up a mirror to Bek, forcing him to see that his divine inspiration was not coming from the gods, but from a bottle. As the tonic worked its way through his system, the mystical fog in Beck's mind began to lift. The serene confidence in his eyes was replaced by a dawning, horrifying clarity. He saw himself not as a chosen one, but as a puppet. The divine wisdom he had been spouting was nothing more than the eloquent ramblings of an intoxicated man. The shame that washed over him was immense. Coffrey had not threatened him. He had given him a dose of truth, and it was more devastating than any poison. Chapter 15: An Offering of Smoke and Steel. The collapse of the conspiracy was swift. A shamed and terrified Beck confessed everything to his brother, the pharaoh. He detailed the manipulations of the vizier Kuruf and the shadowy priests of the inner circle. Pharaoh Amosis's reaction was that of a soldier betrayed. His rage was cold and absolute. He saw the plot not just as treason against him, but as a sacrilegious perversion of the state by the very men sworn to protect its soul. He summoned his royal guard. His intention was clear: to march on Karnak, arrest the inner circle, and purge the priesthood with fire and steel. This was the crisis Khafre had spent his entire priesthood trying to avoid: a direct, violent confrontation between the palace and the temple. As messengers reported the pharaoh's army assembling, Khafre acted. He sent a single urgent request for a private audience before the pharaoh passed his final judgment. Amosis granted it, receiving him not in the open court, but in his private armory, a room of polished bronze shields and sharp-bladed kopashes. The message was clear. This was a meeting about power, not prayer. Khafre entered, not as a supplicant, but as a peer. He carried two things. In one hand, he held a smoldering censer from which rose the thick, calming smoke of the finest caiaphas. In the other, he carried a heavy bound stack of papyrus scrolls. "You have come to plead for traitors, priest." Amosis's voice was like ice. "I have come to make an offering, great Horus," Khafre replied, his voice steady. He placed the scrolls on a table between them. "These are the temple's ledgers. They detail our grain stores, enough to prevent famine for 2 years. They detail our gold reserves, which can fund your army's next campaign. They detail our management of the lands that provide a third of the kingdom's wealth." He then raised the censer, letting the fragrant smoke fill the space between them. "This," he said, gesturing to the smoke, "is what the people see: the mystery, the faith that keeps the farmer in his field and the soldier loyal to your banner. It is the smoke of our authority." He then pointed to the ledgers. "And this is the stone, the practical economic reality that underpins your entire kingdom. You can destroy the smoke, my pharaoh, but you will shatter the stone in the process." He offered a new covenant. The priests of the inner circle would be exiled, their power broken. The temple would submit to the pharaoh's financial oversight, an offering of steel, but its sacred rites, its mysteries, its role as the spiritual heart of the nation must remain inviolate, an offering of smoke. Chapter 16: The Unseen Balance. Pharaoh Amosis, the pragmatist, looked at the calm, resolute high priest before him. He saw the truth in Khafre's words. A war against the temple would be a war against the soul and the stomach of his own people. It would be a catastrophic victory. He accepted the bargain. The vizier Kurif and the old priests were quietly exiled to a distant oasis, their names erased from the records. A new era of cooperation, born of mutual respect and mutually assured destruction, began. Years passed. Khafre grew old in his service. The fire of his youth had tempered into a deep, quiet wisdom. He was still the keeper of the lotus, but he was a different kind of keeper. He used the sacred chemistry not to manufacture visions for kings or to create false miracles, but to heal the sick, to calm the grieving, and to provide the gentle communal euphoria of the festivals that bound the people together. He taught his chosen successor not the secrets of power, but the burdens of responsibility. One evening, as an old man, he stood on the temple balcony, Watching the lights of Thebes twinkle below, he saw the order, the peace, the enduring strength of his civilization. He knew better than anyone the fragile, complex, and often illusory web that held it all together. He had not cleansed the system of its secrets, for he knew the world needed its beautiful lies, but he had infused it with a measure of truth, a dose of conscience. He had spent his life walking in the shadow of the lotus, and in the end, he had learned to find the unseen balance in its heart.